Welcome back, YouTube frogs. Kazuha is here, so it's time for my complete guide. Here's a quick debrief on Kazuha, our newest 5-star Nemo character in the second banner of Genshin 1.6 update. In this guide, we'll be going over 3-star, 4-star, and 5-star weapon options, talents and their priorities, constellations and their breakdowns, different combo rotations, artifact recommendations and stats, team compositions, and ending with a showcase. With Kazuha being more of a support, sub-DPS buffing 5-star Nemo character, I'm going to be splitting this guide up into a mini section focused on pure elemental mastery swirl damage, which will focus on specific elemental mastery swords, and the main section which is on support sub-DPS. These two sections will showcase slightly different builds to give you guys a feel on how both perform, and also to showcase its flexibility and variance in potential builds, which I personally really enjoy. This guide will likely be a long video, like the other guides, so everything will be timestamped for your convenience. Feel free to skip around for what you need. Alright, let's begin. Alright, let's take a quick look at my Kazuha. So you can see him here. He's level 80, C0. I do have C6 prepared, but I'm going to be saving that for after the guide. Check out the poll video if you haven't already. I really appreciate it. Level 6 talents as well. 4 new characters. This is our bread and butter for guides. So we typically start with level 80, we start with C0, and we have level 6 talents. So for all of these tests, we will be running 4 Viridescent artifact set, but we'll be swapping out certain pieces for different parts of the guide to showcase the pure EM build, which is triple EM main stat, and the sub DPS, which is EM, a Nemo, and then crit rate or crit damage mask. Now, even though I'll be showcasing his raw damage with each weapon, his design is focused on support, so his utility in CC cannot be captured in numbers, and swirl cannot crit. Keep that in mind, all right? We'll be testing nearly all the 4-star and 5-star weapons, and sprinkling in some of the 3-star weapons to showcase what his damage and swirl output is in nearly every situation. I'll go into specific details shortly. Let's take a look at talents. This is going to be a decently long discussion because his talents are the bread and butter of how he works, but they may be too complicated to fully grasp, all right? So I'm going to do my best to capture this. First, Ascension talent. This is his bread and butter sub DPS capability. When his E swirls with Hydro, Pyro, Cryo, or Electro, his post-E plunge attack will deal additional that element damage equal to 200% of his attack. So this 200% can be viewed as a multiplier. The same multiplier that you see here, you can view 200% as a quote-unquote multiplier. So this means at level 6, his post-E plunge damage, which is 297% at high. Both the tap E and hold E do high plunge damage, by the way. This has been tested and confirmed. So you don't ever have to worry about low plunge damage off of the E. So this is 297% from the high plunge damage plus 200% from the first Ascension talent, which is about 500% damage off of an E. So you may be thinking this is very strong, and you're right, it is. This is the core of why sub-DPS Kazuha is a very strong build, alongside his pure EM swirl form. This is a great thing because this allows multiple flexible builds. 4th Ascension talent. This is his bread and butter team buffing ability, and is reminiscent of Sucrose's 4th Ascension talent that grants elemental mastery to party members. But instead, Kazuha buffs elemental bonus damage corresponding to the elemental swirl. So instead of EM, he gives LE bonus damage. If you decide to run a pure elemental mastery build, your EM I would anticipate to range anywhere between 700 to 1000. This leads to a corresponding elemental damage bonus buff of around 28 to 40%. Now the last part, bonuses for different elements can coexist. It's very nice and just means that he can buff multiple elements at the same time if he manages to swirl multiple different ones in quick succession. So this is most obvious when you're dealing with a group of slimes that have different elements. If you manage to swirl all of them, you're going to get a elemental bonus damage for all of these swirls that you did. All right, so these talents are both very strong, but they don't actually synergize very well. The first Ascension talent is maximized with an attack crit rate based build. All right, so this one that focuses on Kazuha's personal damage. This leads to a sub DPS build that sacrifices team buffing capability for his own plunge and skill damage. Now the thing is that this 200% attack can also crit, so that's part of why it's sub DPS build. Like you'd build him as like a normal DPS, is that you'll be quick swapping him all the time just for the extra E and plunge, right? Now the 4th Ascension talent is maximized with a swirl based build. Those of you who don't know, swirl can't crit. I'm going to reiterate that as many random times as I can because there's going to be probably some comments like wondering about it, right? Swirl cannot crit. Swirl damage scales based off of the level of your character and your total elemental mastery. This means that to maximize this buffing talent, we would be sacrificing the attack crit for pure elemental mastery. This leads to the second build, which is pure EM swirl, right? Now, the great thing about both of these is that they can mix and match. Having a little bit of both sub DPS and EM also works very well as a balanced build. So again, his flexibility is really beneficial. I'll be showcasing what the pure EM build looks like with the specific EM weapons that we have, and also the sub DPS build with all the other potential weapons. Now let's move on to his actual talents. His normal attack is the bread and butter for his plunge damage post E. People, I think, forget about this, but every single time that you E, you are also plunging, right? And the plunging is not related to his E multiplier. It's related to his normal attack. So both the tap E and the hold E give access to high plunge damage. So that multiplier is the most important to look at. Now at level 6, it's 297% high plunge damage. That's high. It's the same as Xiao's, and Xiao is known to be a plunge damage dealer, right? Oh, also, for the normal attack, I do want to mention that if you do it off of the E, it is a Nemo damage, so this becomes, 290%, but on a Nemo damage, which is fairly nice. Let's go to talk about his E. This is his core skill, all right? So the press can be used in midair, which is fairly nice. It also gives him access to better positioning options, and the hold is just a bigger vacuum. Plunge damage, it leaves behind a vacuum, and both hold E and tap E do the same thing. The tap E is a small vacuum, and it grants 3 anima or anima orbs of energy on 6-second cooldown. Hold E is a larger vacuum and grants 4 anima orbs of energy on a 9-second cooldown. So that's 33% more energy if you do hold E. There are uses for both and drawbacks for both, all right? So high refinement sacrificial sword allows for a consistent hold E playstyle. It grants a very large amount of energy and large CC, which makes for amazing Q up time with sacrificing damage. Tap E on a 6-second cooldown makes for an incredibly active playstyle in a fast swap composition and sub DPS playstyle. So both are good, right? Both have their uses depending on the weapon that you use. Both have their reasons for their drawbacks and their fortes. All right, so his Q. His Q is his unique Venti-like skill that first absorbs, usually, the closest element of the character following an element priority, PHEC, which is Pyro, Hydro, Electro, Cryo, then connects the slash and swirls the DPS, all right? So initial slash in the beginning that swirls, and then 5 ticks of damage over 8 seconds, reminiscent of Venti's Q, with an element absorption. The multiplier for this skill over the entire duration at level 6 is almost 1,500%, which is fairly solid but not overpowered. This remains on the field when swapping out, which is perfect for fast swap comps, and also costs 60 energy on a 15-second cooldown, similarly to Venti, so he doesn't suffer too much from recharge issues. I still would recommend trying to hover anywhere between 120 to 150% recharge to maintain his Q uptime, which happens to have a very unique Kazuha-only mechanic, which we will explain later. This means that the ER swords that we currently have open up more offensive artifacts since they satisfy his lower ER requirement by themselves. Alright, so talent priority to level up. To be blunt, it's really simple. I recommend leveling them all to level 8. His E and his normal attack should stay the same level, since every E leads to a plunge attack. Q's multiplier is worth leveling up, and it's on a 15-second cooldown, so with decent recharge, the uptime can be maintained. If we're going for specifics, it comes down to how well you can keep his Q uptime. The better your artifacts and weapons to recharge his Q, the more priority that skill has to level, alright? So at the end of the day, his kit deserves all level 8 investment. If you have really good Q uptime, go Q first. The E and the normal attack should stay the same. Let's go through his constellations really quick, yeah? So his constellations are generally pretty powerful, and although they're not necessary for his playstyle, they actually improve his combo flow quite a bit. His C1 is quite powerful and unlocks the hold EQ reset that doesn't rely on high refined sacrificial sword. I'll go into the details later on sac sword, because that can also reset hold E. This constellation by nature then improves his energy recharge with his E resetting, and he already doesn't have a high ER requirement. I think the first thing is something that's overlooked a little bit. The 10-second cooldown on the E turns his tap CD to 5.4 seconds and his hold CD to 8.1. You guys might not think that's huge, but pushes his hold E cooldown 1 second closer to the tap E original cooldown, right? So tap E originally is 6 seconds and hold E is 9 seconds. This turns his hold E into 8 seconds. This makes it less punishing to spam the hold E for more energy and greater CC and fast swap comps. It's a great constellation. C2. This is the constellation that power creeps Sucrose a bit. It basically grants your entire team 200 elemental mastery, including Kazuha under his Q. But Kazuha only gets 200 and not 400, since the constellation doesn't stack on top of itself. Typically, Sucrose transfers would be maximum 20% of her EM, and high-end Sucroses reached 900 to 1000 EM, which is about 200. So this essentially replaces that portion of Sucrose transfer. And if Sucrose swirls, it does give it additional 50, but I'm not going to count that in this. So between 200 to 250 on the high-end Sucroses. With C2 and a pure swirl build, Kazuha grants his team members 200 EM, and he gains 200 for himself, which also boosts his elemental bonus damage transfer. This is very powerful for reaction-based compositions and massive vaporized melt showcases, but it's locked behind C2, right? So C6 Sucrose, which people might have at this point, right, with all the Sucrose rate ups, still is very viable, right, and extremely strong, and we'll get to the FAQs about that later. C2 kind of, you know, negates the need for Sucrose's transfer this way. This also makes the Q priority in uptime, so minimum recharge is incentivized to loop his Q, because every single time he's Q, you get these buffs. Nothing to say about C3. It's plus 3 levels to his E. C4. This is just an improvement to his recharge and synergizes well with both his C1 and C2. Free recharge for using his skill in tap or hold mode and just gliding. C5. Plus 3 levels to his Q. Nothing special there. And then C6. So this turns Kaza into an Anemo main DPS for 5 seconds after his E or Q. Stacked with the other constellations, he can basically maintain 100% uptime on Anemo infusion. If you do reach this point, I'd anticipate your EM to be minimum 300 with maybe the Freedom Sworn Sword and his Ascension stat, which brings his minimum buff to 60% normal charge plunge damage in the same column as Anemo, right? So it's about a 35 to 40% damage increase minimum. Now, those whales out there who do C6 him, I'd anticipate an EM Anemo crit sub DPS build at first, so probably hovering 500 to 600 EM, which is 100% normal charge plunge bonus. However, this is a rare circumstance where an attack or elemental mastery goblet may scale better than Anemo damage, since his EM converts to additional damage off of this constellation, right? A 187 elemental mastery goblet will naturally give 37.4% normal charge plunging damage, which is 80% of the effectiveness of an elemental goblet. You just lose damage on his base E and Q skill damage. So opens up more options for his artifacts in C6. With nice artifacts, he becomes a very strong sub DPS. So yeah, those are his constellations. All right, so quick talk on combo rotation. C0 Kazuha with no sacrificial sword. Pretty straightforward. There's nothing special mechanic that you have to do, right? Tap or hold E and then Q whenever necessary. In my opinion, though, it is more important to hold E after Kazuha's Q to regroup enemies back to his Q, right? So if you're queuing, grouping everything inside, that's what I would recommend. So, small notes to maximize his gameplay. Kazuha tap E mid jump, which is easy to get used to. Gives you a little bit more space to reposition in the air for plunge attack back. So what that means is, like, this is normal, right? But with jumping and then tap E, get a little bit more breathing room to refocus your plunge vacuum, right? So you can do a vacuum there, and then you can do a vacuum there. There's still vacuum that persists, right? And then it's up again. The consistency of how often that he can CC enemies is really nice. I really like it. With C1, there's a simple add-on. It basically gives you a free hold E right before you Q because it'll reset the cooldown, right? So you can do hold E and then Q, and you'll get the orbs back. If you're about to Q and you have your E up, just hold E first to get the free orbs, so free CC, and free damage before the Q. Now, with high refinement, Sacrificial Sword in C0, I recommend leading with the Q and then proceeding to double hold E. The higher the refinements, the better, because hold E is much less punishing with Sacrificial Sword, so it becomes a staple. With high refined, Sacrificial Sword, and C1, I still recommend your first combo to be Q and then double hold E. But after you do that, then you can do hold E, Q, and then E, right? So that's fine. So that should be it for the combo rotation. Just enjoy tap-ing if you don't have Sacrificial Sword, or double hold E spamming with post-Q with Sacrificial Sword, right? So just enjoy that. It'll be pretty fun. All right, I think I've covered most of the basic grounds for Kazuha now. I will get into how testing will work, just to be a quick explanation. So the first half of testing will be dedicated to pure EM support swirl build, where we test 3 elemental mastery swords: Iron Sting, Alley Flash, and Freedom Sworn. Honorable mention to the Dark Iron Sword, which grants 128 EM at level 80, but this weapon is currently only obtainable once in the game from a Leah vendor, so I currently don't want to level it. Given that I'm testing EM, Another important reminder, I've said this multiple times, but I want to reiterate, swirl damage cannot crit. It only scales with your character's level and how much EM you have. For testing this build, I will be comparing raw swirl damage at level 80 with Elemental Mastery. I'll still be comparing the E skill damage, his passive plunge, his general Q, but with no crits. Unlike with normal testing, where crits are bread and butter for sub DPS or main DPS, pure EM testing should never expect a crit. I may crit in my testing footage, but I will calculate the non-crit damage so you guys can compare properly. I will not be testing pure EM with other swords because IMO. If you have other sword options, I would advise sub DPS build. It's a great balance build that does not throw away the naturally decent multipliers and is first ascension talent, right? So for sub DPS testing, I will open up my entire roster of 3-star, 4-star, and 5-star swords. I'll also be including the previous 3 Elemental Mastery swords in the sub DPS testing, so you can see what they look like under a different build. We have, if you can see here, 17 swords I prepared. So no matter if you are new, veteran, F2P, whale, or don't even play the game, your weapon is in here. We will start with the 3-star weapons. Fillet Blade, since the trailer showcased it, which is more meme. Harbinger of Dawn, due to its insanely high crit rate and crit damage stats, while sacrificing attack, and also because Kazuha's mobility and fast swap makes it easier to maintain his HP pool for his passive. Then we'll be moving on to the 4-star weapons. I'm going to start with the Perdap Ranker, because this is only if you're committed to physical DPS. Then we'll have the Flute as a generic attack percent based weapon. Then we'll move on to the Elemental Mastery 4-star swords, Iron Sting, Alley Flash. Then comparing Black Sword, Blackcliff. And then Energy Recharge, Favonius, Sacrificial, Festering Desire. And then finally, Lion's Roar, which synergizes with a lot of composition that focuses on Kazuha's Q absorbing Pyro. After that, we have 5 of the 5-star weapons. Summit Shaper, Scour Blade, Jade Cutter, Aquila Favonia, and the new Freedom Sworn in no particular order. The 5-star weapons are all pretty different in what they provide, so we'll see how they do. As for artifacts on sub DPS, I'll still be running 4 Viridescent, but instead of triple EM main set, I'll be running EM Sands, Anemo Goblet, and Crit Rate Mask. When you get to the testing, you'll be able to see all the artifacts. You can pause if you need to. Crit Damage Mask we'll be using for 3 crit rate weapons: Harbinger of Dawn, Black Sword, and Jade Cutter. I'll be hovering at around 70 crit rate for all these sub DPS tests that you can see around here, with the exception of Jade Cutter, which will push me probably to above 90%. That's expected because that weapon is a ridiculous crit rate stat stick. All right, final reminder. For these tests on sub DPS only, not pure EM swirl, I will be using this crit rate food to boost my crit rate and make testing easier for myself. This does not affect the damage output we'll be comparing, since I compare all crit numbers and I'll make a note of how much crit rate each weapon has as a base. That means if I eat this food, I'm going to be at 90 crit rate, but for all the numbers that I'll be showing, it will be 70, right? It will be decreasing. So it should all be relatively maintained. All right, let's get into testing. We're going to be doing EM testing first, yes? So we'll begin with the Iron Sting. And if you guys want to see, I'm still on 4 Viridescent set. Pause if you need to for my artifact stats. But I have very, very high Elemental Mastery, especially on the Flower, which has 70 right now, and my Feather, which is off-piece, which is 107. I'm running an EM main stat on every single piece here. So you can see here that my Kazuha has 974 Elemental Mastery with an R180 Iron Sting. It's going to be the basis for our testing. We're not going to be paying attention to the crit rate, crit damage, because Swirl cannot crit. Let's get into the testing, and let's see how the Iron Sting does for Swirl damage. So you can see here that Iron Sting with 974 Elemental Mastery, we do 5,084 damage on a Pyro Swirl, and we are only level 80, so this damage will increase if I were to get Kazuha to level 90, so keep that in mind. But I'm going to keep on level 80 for these so you can see how much Swirl damage it is. That is Iron Sting. Let's move on to the other 2. Next up is Alley Flash. With the Iron Sting, 974 Elemental Mastery with Ascension of 4 passive, he grants 38.96% elemental damage bonus, so 38.96% boost. Now with the Alley Flash, since we go down to 873 Elemental Mastery, this buff decreases down to 34.9%, so 4% lower boost here. So with Alley Flash and the same artifacts, I have 873 Elemental Mastery. Alley Flash does have increased damage dealt by the character equipping this weapon by 24%. However, this does not affect swirl damage. This is only for your normal attack and crit damage. So you can see here that the Pyro Swirl is less damage. So 873 Elemental Mastery is 486% increase to swirl damage, and we did 4,804 damage with the Pyro Swirl. That's Alley Flash. Now, finally, for the last EM test, we have Freedom Sworn. Your eyes do not deceive you. With the level 80 R1 Freedom Sworn, with these artifacts, I'm able to hit 1,004 Elemental Mastery naturally. Now, the thing is, I actually have slightly better artifact than this for EM. My maximum is like 1023 with this. But I'm not going to be using this because I still prefer the energy recharge and the crit damage on this one. Right, this one has less recharge. But yeah, 1004 elemental mastery. Let's see the swirl damage. So you can see here, 1004 EM was able to knock out 5165 Pyro Swirl. The Q typically swirls between 5 to 6 times in a single Q, and that is just for a single element swirl. So if you group up a bunch of elements, then the Q can swirl multiple times in each tick. So with 1004 elemental mastery, 5165 is the Pyro Swirl damage. And for those curious, 534.8% swirl increase damage. And then this is also, you know, if you're curious, 160% vaporized melt, 185% crystallized absorption. But yeah, those are the elemental mastery weapons. We have Alley Flash, Iron Sting, and Freedom Sworn. So there is another one, honorable mention to the Dark Iron Sword. This one gives 128 elemental mastery at level 80. So it is an option, but I feel like if you are going to be doing a pure EM swirl build, right? Pure EM swirl build means you don't care about any stats because swirl cannot crit. So you ignore crit rate, you ignore crit damage, energy recharge is a valuable stat, and then EM. That's literally it. Not even attack percent matters at this point. So this is for team buffing, right? And you can see that with 1004 elemental mastery, I get a 40.16% elemental damage bonus. Unfortunately, this is not for a Nemo. It's only for Pyro, Hydro, Electro, Cryo. Given that's the case, just to give an end discussion on the elemental mastery weapons, go for highest EM possible. So if you are going Alley Flash, or if you have Alley Flash and you want to use it, I would actually recommend sub DPS Kazuha, as you'll see in the future testing. So stick with Iron Sting if you're free to play and you want to do pure EM swirl build for a specific like boosting buffing build. Freedom Sworn is slightly better than Iron Sting with 30 more elemental mastery. I think that's a given that they want to incentivize whales to pull on it. But yeah, so 181 elemental mastery if you manage to get the Freedom Sworn. Don't recommend it for any FTP budget players. Iron Sting is good enough. 151 is very high. If you don't have Iron Sting or you don't want to craft it and you have the Dark Iron Sword, there's only one in this game right now. You can see that I've locked it. It's only R1. 128 at level 80. Those are the options. If you're going pure EM swirl, slam the highest EM. It's as simple as it is. Okay, let's move on to sub DPS testing. We're going to begin with the 3-star weapons. And you see here that there are only 2 3-star weapons at my disposal here. Fillet Blade and Harbinger of Dawn. Fillet Blade was shown in the trailer, which is why I'm just going to be meme testing it. The Harbinger of Dawn is a weapon that Albedo uses just to test it out because it does grant you an immense amount of crit rate and crit damage, 20% crit rate when HP is above 90%, crit damage at 42.7%. This weapon requires your HP to be above 90%, but Kazuha's playstyle actually, you know, kind of synergistic to this. So yeah, that's why I'm going to be testing it. Cool. So we're going to begin with the Fillet Blade. And these are the stats here. Artifacts for the sub DPS build. If you need to pause, go for it. Going to be running Elemental Mastery, Anemo Damage, and a crit rate. Okay, so Fillet Blade time. Let's test it out and see how it does. All right, as you can see, Fillet Blade doesn't actually do that bad. Though it is damage-wise relatively weak because it's a 3-star weapon, I think Kazuha's multipliers are high enough that even a 3-star weapon can still perform relatively well. Weapon passive is 4,000 damage every 11 seconds. But yeah, it's mostly just a meme weapon. Let's move on to more legitimately Harbinger of Dawn. Now with Harbinger of Dawn, I'm going to be switching to a crit damage mask. You can see here that with this, I have 77.7 crit rate and 212 crit damage with those same artifacts. Let's see how this does. So you can see with Harbinger of Dawn R5, the damage is actually, you know, it's fairly solid. You can see that the tap E, plunge damage, and hold E damage are still maintaining solid ground even with the 3-star weapon. What we really have to test is how this compares to some of the 4-star weapons. And based off of my preliminary tests, it actually does fairly well against some of the 4-star weapons. So a Harbinger of Dawn, if you're not looking for recharge, it's actually fairly strong stat stick. And if you can maintain its HP above 90%, then you get a pretty big crit rate buff. So yeah, so if you do consider to do Harbinger of Dawn, you may realize that, oh, maybe Harbinger of Dawn, since it's easier to level up, it's actually more useful than some of the forces that I have that you'll see coming soon. If you do maintain HP above 90%, then you do get a massive crit rate and crit damage boost. So this weapon is still on the table for usage for Kazuha. All right, let's move on to the 4-star weapons. You can see here my massive selection. I have actually 10 4-star weapons. Let's begin with Prototype Ranker, and this one I'm going to be testing first because this is only if you're considering doing like a physical main DPS Kazuha or you have no other option. So I'm still going to be testing it out. You'll see the damage numbers here. All right, so these are the standard stats that we see here. You can see that the Elemental Mastery is, my base is going to be 320 Elemental Mastery. So this is not going to be changing for most of the weapons except for Iron Sting and Alley Flash. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Cool. So you can already see here that the prototype ranker is even weaker than the Harbinger of Dawn in terms of damage output. For sub DPS, this is expected because even with the passive, the physical damage bonus doesn't write home over the crit rate and crit damage that the Harbinger brings. Definitely, I wouldn't recommend prototype ranker unless you're doing more physical-based Kazuha. Okay, so let's move on to the flute, which is the generic attack percent weapon. With this weapon, our attack boosts up to 1470, and we still maintain the same other stats. So you can see that even R5 Flute at level 80 still does not actually outdamage the Harbinger of Dawn. It honestly depends. The damage is really close. Attack percent versus the massive amount of crit damage. Consider either or. If you are going to be pairing him with Bennett, then you are going to be getting an attack boost from Bennett, which makes Harbinger probably scale a little bit better. Flute is just generic attack percent weapon. If you decide to use it, these are the numbers. Let's move on to Iron Sting. It was tested for the pure EM build. It's fairly strong for that. Let's see for a sub DPS build. His elemental mastery goes up to 470. His attack is decently low. We are going to be activating his passive, and all of these are still maintained. So you can see here that Iron Sting doesn't really match up to its competitors, really. Iron Sting is strictly for the pure EM swirl buffing build. If you're doing sub DPS, I would not recommend Iron Sting. You can stick with the Harbinger of Dawn 3-star weapon. Even prototype ranker still gives more attack percent, general stat boost. But if you want to mix and match, this is fine. You'll be sacrificing his E and Q damage and plunge damage over the swirl and buffing. Okay, so that's Iron Sting. Let us move on to the corresponding elemental mastery weapon, which is Alley Flash. Now, this weapon has way higher base attack and also increases damage dealt by the character by 24% if you don't take damage. In quick swap comps, where you're utilizing his E to jump over enemies and dodge attacks, and then proc your Q for iframe and then switch out, this is beneficial. With the Alley Flash, we are 13-16 attack. Our elemental mastery is 370. All the corresponding stats and buffs that he gives are calculated. So let's see how Alley Flash does. All right, so you see with Alley Flash, we get the damage is equivalent to Harbinger of Dawn, but one thing that we do get is a little bit more elemental mastery. And also our plunge damage. So our first ascension passive damage is increased. And this is because Alley Flash's additional damage here is in the same column as your elemental physical, but it's for all damage. So essentially, your pyro damage here is increased by 24% because of this weapon. If you do have this weapon, and I believe at R1 it's 12%, Alley Flash is definitely a weapon that is possible for sub DPS. Moving on from the elemental mastery weapons, let's take a look at Black Sword. Now with Black Sword, I'm going to be switching to a crit damage mask to offset the amount of crit rate it gives. With these stats, my attack is 12-16. We still maintain about 70-75 crit rate. Our crit damage is boosted up. Black Sword crit rate 25%. And so yeah, let's see. So you can see here that the Black Sword is generically a sub DPS weapon. And if you do have BP, you might have one lying around. It's totally possible. The strange thing is, if you do have decent playstyle with Kazuha and you don't take that much damage, Harbinger of Dawn still does more. And I keep repeating that weapon because it actually surprised me how much it did. That's because it's such a big boost to your crit rate, crit damage that allows you to build differently, right? You want to keep it out there that 3-star weapons do still compete with some of the other meta weapons. All right, from the Black Sword, let's move on to a Blackcliff Longsword. Now with Blackcliff Longsword, I'm going to be switching back to a crit rate mask. You'll see that my stats are maintained relatively equally. 70, 160 here, whereas the Black Sword, I had 169 crit damage, so a little bit less crit damage here. I will not be proccing the passive on the Blackcliff, right? But if you do manage to do this AoE-wise, it is. Also, color scheme looks pretty solid. And if you do this against AoE mobs and you get the attack percent buff, it actually becomes pretty strong. Stronger than the Black Sword. All right, so you can see that Blackcliff Longsword with no passive stats and just swapping out the mask did basically the same damage as Black Sword. Now, the reason is because Black Sword's passive is mostly for normal charge attack damage increase, not plunge, which makes it fall behind because in most circumstances, even with no passive, Blackcliff will still perform the same. But against mobs, Blackcliff actually outperforms by gaining up to 36% attack boost at just R1. So if you have R5 Blackcliff Longsword and you do fight this against AoE mobs, you're probably going to see a pretty high amount of damage come out from this weapon. It also looks aesthetically pleasing, so this is definitely a Star Glitter option for those that don't have any other weapons. So let's move on to the energy recharge ones. Now, with the energy recharge weapons, base damage goes down quite a bit, but recharge is very high. So now here's the thing. If you do decide to go energy recharge weapons, I actually don't recommend you have energy recharge on substat because I don't think he needs more than 150%. For these energy recharge weapons, expect less damage, but I guarantee you, your Q uptime is going to be basically always up on cooldown. That is something I can't capture in these damage tests, but understand that some of these other weapons may have energy recharge problems. With general energy recharge weapons, you can build more offensive on artifacts, so consider that. All right, so Favonius Sword, that was the damage. The damage is obviously relatively low. The damage is about 25% lower than the other damage-based swords, but remember Q uptime. Consider the utility of Favonius Sword, right? We all know how powerful Favonius weapons are just because of the passive generating elemental particles. Sub DPS quick swap comps where you can sacrifice this damage for more team uptime. Definitely a solid choice. All right, so from Favonius Sword, we'll go to Sacrificial Sword. And the reason why I'm doing the energy recharge weapons last is because I actually prefer these. I'll talk about this at the end discussion. Sacrificial Sword. Now, the thing with Sacrificial Sword versus Favonius Sword, but they have literally identical stats. So they will be doing the exact same amount of damage with the exact same build. All right, so you can see here, that was the same damage as Favonius Sword as expected. The thing about this, and what I really like about Sacrificial Sword, is that at C0, you're not as punished for pressing hold E for Sacrificial Sword. It's actually a build that I actually recommend. If you do have high refinement, if you have low refinement like R1, R2, I don't recommend it. I'll get into this discussion after we finish all the testing and go over all the weapons as a whole. All right, so Festering Desire is next. Festering Desire, a little bit higher attack. Mine is level 90 because it leveled up during the event. My energy recharge dropped a little bit, but still very high at 174%. Let's see. All right, so as you guys can see with Festering Desire, my E damage is very high, comparable to the other damage-based weapons, but I also do get the energy recharge. Passive giving crit rate to your E is actually also beneficial as well. So the only thing is that your Q sacrificed a little bit, but that's totally fine. I think generally these energy recharge weapons are very good to use on a support like him who wants his Q uptime as much as possible. Okay, let's move on from Festering Desire. The last one, this is unique. Lion's Roar. And the reason why I'm going to be testing Lion's Roar is because the passive, where it increases damage against opponents affected by Pyro and Electro by 36%, is actually fairly easy to maintain uptime on for him if you maintain your Q up. The most of the time when you infuse, if you're going to be running with Bennett, it's excellent because Bennett almost always guarantees that Kazuha's Q is Pyro. We'll talk about that more later. So you can see here that with the attack percent gain here and the 36% at R5, we'll see how much damage it does. All right, so you can see with the passive of Pyro, you saw how much damage, right? The hold E broke 5 digits. So we did 10,400 damage with hold E. The plunge damage, tap E were all very high. Even the passive damage on the Ascension Talon 1 did 5.5k, exceeds all the other 4-star weapons. And the Q also does an immense amount of damage. So if you do sub DPS Lion's Roar, very high damage, just make sure that you maintain your Q uptime. Especially if you're running Bennett, it's definitely a viable option. All right, so that wraps up the 4-star weapons for Kazuha. So I'm going to give my quick and brief thoughts for each of the weapons. Prototype Ranker, Flute, I don't recommend. Harbinger of Dawn outscales both of these, and especially if you have Bennett paired with Kazuha, then you get the attack buff from there. Elemental Mastery weapons. Iron Sting, I recommend only for the pure EM build. I don't recommend it for the sub DPS. Alley Flash, good for sub DPS, and you also get a little bit of Elemental Mastery for his buffing. Black Sword versus Blackcliff Longsword. Black Sword is actually on the weaker side. Probably you guys didn't expect that, but Black Sword is on the weaker side because the passive doesn't really benefit his damage output. It benefits his healing, but that's not really a factor considering how much mobility he has. Blackcliff Longsword, definitely an aesthetically pleasing build for him. And also if you're against AoE mobs, you're going to be doing a lot more damage, especially at higher refinement. So consider this for sub DPS. And then the energy recharge weapons. My personal preference, Favonius Sword, Sacrificial Sword, Festering Desire, all great energy recharge weapons. They all grant him the energy recharge that he needs for minimum Q uptime, about 45 to 55% depending on the level. That just maintains his recharge at about 150, right? And you don't need energy recharge on the substats of your artifacts. Personal favorite based off of the testing, Sacrificial Sword, I really like the feel, and I'll be demonstrating Sacrificial Sword probably in one of the showcases just because you guys can see the Q double E form. So that is energy recharge weapons. Lastly, Lion's Roar. If you're pairing Kazuha with Bennett, this is a very strong sub DPS weapon. All the stats are useful for him. It also looks, you know, fairly decent with him as well. Definitely an option. Exceeds the other 4-star weapons by a solid 15% damage at R5. So yeah, that's the 4-star weapons. Pick and choose. There's a bunch here that I tested. Do what you will with them. Compare them with the 3-stars as well. And yeah, that's the 4-star weapons. All right, let's move on to the 5-star weapons. So begin with Skyward Blade. relatively decent. I don't think there's anything to write home about the Skyward Blade, but attack is decent. Energy recharge is good. But yeah, let's see how it performs. So yeah, the Skyward Blade isn't really anything to write home about. The only thing that you get from this weapon is the energy recharge and the 4% crit rate. 10% movement speed is nice, but not necessary. 10% attack speed doesn't really benefit him because he does plunge damage. Correspondingly for the passive right, doesn't really benefit him. So let's move on to the next 5-star weapon, Summit Shaper. Alright, so with the Summit Shaper, I'm going to be activating the passive, but I'm not going to be having my shield strength. Just the easiest way, right? I'm not going to guarantee that you have shield on your team, but I can definitely guarantee that you're going to be like whacking with this weapon to get the passive up. So consider that. With the Summit Shaper, which is a very big attack percent stat stick, you can see that my attack is very high, still maintaining the same crit rate, crit damage, and then energy recharge. Okay, so you can see with the Summit Shaper actually does a massive amount of damage when you have its passive proc. So my attack is 1661 without the passive. When I have all the stacks on the Summit Shaper, my attack goes to 1820, and you can see that the plunge damage, tappy, hold damage were relatively equal to the Lion's Roar, which is 10k hold E, 8.6k plunge, and tappy was 7.8k. The Q damage was also very high, so definitely a weapon. If you do have this, it's generically a good stat stick. And the thing that surprised me about this weapon, but it's not surprising anymore, is that because he's more Elemental Mastery focused, and that I'm running EM Anemo crit rate for most of these tests, he actually lacks attack percent. So if you're doing sub DPS build, this kind of compensates for his attack percent if you go EM timepiece. So yeah, that's Summit Shaper. Let's move on to Aquila Favonia. So my Aquila Favonia is level 90 R2. The reason why it's level 90 is because I level 90 this a long time ago for Bennett's attack transfer. Just understand that with these 5-star weapons, most of them are generally viable, except for the Skyward Blade. I really don't recommend this one. But everything else should perform relatively strong, so it just depends on what you have. All right, so with the Aquila Favonia, 1700 attack, same general stats. If you decide to do physical DPS, then you have some physical damage bonus. So, Aquila Favonia, generically good stat stick weapon. High base attack at 48. Attack percentage also increased from its passive. You do get a burst heal every so often. The damage was slightly lower than a max stacked Summit Shaper, but it does kind of quote-unquote cheat a little bit because it is level 90. So there's that. Still, generically decent weapon. So let's move on to Primordial Jade Cutter. Now, this weapon, we all know to be extremely strong because of the insane and unfair, almost, crit rate boost that it gives. 44.1% at level 90. With this weapon, I'm going to be switching to a crit damage mask. But you'll notice that even with a crit damage mask, my crit rate is still 93%. So this weapon grants you bulkiness, converts his HP to attack percent, which he lacks, gives him massive crit rate, allows you to use a crit damage mask, and yeah, I mean, let's just see how it is. All right, so you can see R1 Jade Cutter, 10% stronger than R2 Aquila Favonia at the same level. So for a sub DPS build, very strong. Even for main DPS build, very strong as well. Reason is because your crit rate. So one thing that's like not really counted in these tests is that I gained an additional 20% crit rate on top of most of the weapons, which is not really factored into the quote-unquote damage calculations. But yes, Jade Cutter, definitely top of the line weapon for sub DPS, main DPS. Not really for pure EM swirl, but I think that's expected. So yeah, definitely very strong. All right, last but not least, the new weapon, Freedom Sworn. I only have this at level 80 right now because I just want to test it at its base. I don't expect it to do more damage than the Jade Cutter because it's more of a support weapon. Now, with the crit rate mask, we're still maintaining the same stats as usual. My elemental mastery is 501 now, with the 181 that it gives. Twirl damage increased, buffing capability slightly increased. Attack is the same as the Skyward Blade, I believe. But yeah, with the passive, we'll see how much damage it does. So I think this is expected, but you can see that the Freedom Sworn has decent damage output, but not to the same degree as Summit Shaper, Aquila Favonia, and Jade Cutter. We do get very big Ascension 1 talent boost because the passive 2 buff is now at 20% damage. The hold E does a decent amount of damage, and the Q does a decent amount of damage. All in all, this is a balanced weapon. Doesn't do too much damage, but also buffs your team. However, I do want to mention that if you are an extreme whale and you do have R5 of the sword, every single refinement provides a pretty big boost. You get 2.5% damage here. You also get 4% plunging, and you get 5% attack. It's fairly strong on refinement, but yeah, it's a whale weapon. All right, quick discussion on just generally 5-star weapons. Don't recommend Skyward Blade. I think there are better 4-stars to use and better 5-stars to use. Summit Shaper, good attack percent weapon. Actually stronger than I thought for sub DPS. Aquila Favonia, definitely strong. Don't feel bad about using this. Jade Cutter, definitely the weapon of choice for me if you're doing sub DPS build. And then if you have high refinement Freedom Sworn, then it's going to outpace most of these other weapons. Those are the 5-star weapons. The only weapon that I really don't recommend is Skyward Blade. That's it. Everything else is perfectly fine. All right, so now let's do a quick overview of artifact recommendations, starting with sets. Or Viridescent Venerer, if you can get it. It's made for Anemo characters, and the 4-piece is incredibly powerful for resistance dread, whether you are pure EM or sub DPS or anything in between. If you can't get 4 Viridescent, then 2 Viridescent and Wanderers is enough. Wanderers will grant you that 80 elemental mastery for the 2-piece set. This benefits his buffing into swirls. And then other options include 2 Gladiator for general sub DPS is fine, 2 Noblesse for general Q damage is fine. And then we get to more unique builds. Thundering Fury, where Kazuha spams E-swirls to create electro-induced reactions. You can do this to spam E. And then alternative sub-DPS-based artifacts, which have the same synergy as the Lion Swords, we did test out that weapon, include Lava Walker, if you do decide to do 4-piece Lava Walker, or Thunder Soother, which is electro-based, right? So if you manage, you want to do some unique build, especially like if you want to do like a sub DPS Lion Sword build, these are options for doing 4 Thunder Soother or 4 Lava Walker. If you do choose unique sets like these builds, it becomes more important to maintain your Q uptime for the corresponding Pyro or Electro absorption. And then finally, for newer players who may not have access to any of these 5-star artifact sets yet, don't be afraid to sprinkle in some instructor pieces, right, for the elemental mastery, and or any of the 4-star recharge sets to set you up. Now, let's dive into main stat pieces for the Sands, the Goblet, and the Mask. For the Sands, all 3 work in their respective spots. Elemental Mastery for pure EM swirl or sub DPS is my personal recommendation. Energy Recharge for sub DPS with a focus on Q uptime and an offensive weapon. Attack percent for sub DPS or main DPS. This sacrifices his swirl damage and buffing capability for raw attack. Attack scales a little bit better for C6 main DPS, but not so much for lower constellations C0 to C5, right? Moving on to the Goblet. EM Goblet for pure EM swirl, right? If you're stacking EM. Anemo Goblet for sub DPS or main DPS, and then Attack percent Goblet for specific C6 Whale main DPS builds where the first Ascension plunge damage can infuse with Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo. And then finally, the Mask. Elemental Mastery Mask for pure EM swirl, should be no surprise, or sub DPS. And then crit rate or crit damage for sub DPS main DPS. If you're running sub DPS, I recommend crit over elemental mastery here. I do not recommend attack percent. And that's artifacts in a nutshell. All right, so now that we're done with artifact discussion, let's briefly go over team compositions. Okay, let's first start with the healers and then we'll move on to general teams. So I think it's fairly obvious, but Bennett is extremely good to pair with Kazuha. So Barbara is uniquely good with Kazuha for certain compositions. This actually unlocks a different Morgana comp, which is typically Ganyu, Mona, Diona, Freeze, combined with Venti as a CC hero. But with Barbara as the healer instead, and double cryo. This is a little more niche to pull off, but I'll give the timings to pull it off later. Let's move on to Diona. So Diona is fine, nothing special. She doesn't interact with Kazuha in any unique fashion. Jean is great. They both have short cooldowns and synergize amazingly well for fast swap compositions and generate energy for each other. Noelle. So Noelle, besides the grouping that Kazuha provides for a Noelle showcase, there's nothing unique about the synergy. That's the healers for general teams. Let's talk about holistic teams built off of every main DPS. So Eula, no specific synergy since Kazuha cannot buff physical. I would leave Kazuha for more reaction comp. Ganyu, extremely good and synergistic with both Freeze comp, Freeze Ganyu, and Melt Ganyu. So a Melt Ganyu with Kazuha now looks like this has core. Xiangling Klee as the support for the 4th, or Zhangling to shield. It's very strong. Freeze Ganyu, either Xingqiu or Mona, or even Barbara, right? The specific comps that we discussed about. And then typically Diona as the double cryo, or Rosaria if you do the Barbara side. Keqing with Kazuha. There's a specific Barbara plus Kazuha Electrocharge comp enabled here, but Mona Xingqiu is still stronger. Because we don't have a natural Electro healer, Kazuha plus Keqing plus Barbara plus Beta Official is a possible double Electro comp. So if you do, say for example this, and then you add Beta Official here, it's a potential double Electro Kazuha oriented comp. Then we move on to Tartag. Vaporized Tartag is very strong. It's typically Tartag plus Kazuha and then Bennett Xiangling. So this is a core comp that I'll also showcase. It's very strong. Taser Tartag is also fine, where you would be replacing Xiangling and Bennett here with one Electro like Beta Official and then a healer. With Hu Tao, there's nothing specific. It's an okay synergy with Hu Tao's 9-second duration on the E and Kazuha's 9-second cooldown on hold E. Standard reverse vaporized comp, nothing special here. And then Cleat and Yanfei, which are both our Pyro charged DPSers. Very good for both cases. For Klee specifically, Kazuha is an amazing Pyro booster and vacuums her mini bombs, unlike Venti. Pair with Bennett plus a Hydro support like Mona Xingqiu, you have a decent comp. That exact same comp, you can replace Klee with Yanfei and do the exact same thing. Xiao and Kazuha, to me, there's no special synergy here. Kazuha becomes a minor CC'er and an energy recharger for Xiao. But in my opinion, Xiao is way too greedy for Kazuha's fast play style. I don't typically recommend them together. Diluc. So Diluc is a standard synergy, the same with Klee and Yanfei. And then the national team. So this team, I think I showcase. I love it. It's very strong. Placing Chang Yan with Kazuha and keeping Xiangling, Xingqiu, Bennett, very strong comp. So yeah, I think that should be most of the compositions. I think we went over most of the main DPS and corresponding with Kazuha because he is a supporter. Alright, so now is a good time to explain Kazuha's unique Q mechanics. These mechanics separate him from the other Anemo supports that we have, and they are simple to pull off, especially with Bennett, making them practical to use in game. So, his first Q mechanic is that the Q has an absorption priority. I'm sure you guys know this. Elemental absorption right here. This is different than swirling, and this is an important distinction because it allows for specific interactions. Kazuha's Q leaves behind a field called Autumn Whirlwind that can absorb another element, much like how Venti's Q leaves behind what's called Storm Eye. If you guys are familiar with Venti, Storm Eye, that absorbs another element, right? So for Kazuha's Q, the absorption priority is PHEC. So Pyro over Hydro over Electro over Cryo. So Cryo is the least favored, and then Pyro is the most favored element. So given that Pyro's absorption priority is the highest, if there's all of those elements in the field, Pyro, Hydro, Electro, Cryo, then Q will absorb Pyro. This is important for certain vaporized melt compositions like Ganyu and Tartaglia. So this brings up to the important point. The second important mechanic, and thank you very much to the Keqing mains group for the initial discovery, that extends off of the first that we just discussed is as follows. Kazuha Slash, his Q, summons Autumn Whirlwind around him, which can absorb the first element called Element 1 that is not being swirled, and swirl Element 2 for a Viridescent Resistance Shred, 40% from this artifact piece, and Element 2 damage buff at the same time. So a single ability, his Q, can do both. It can absorb one element, swirl a different element. That means that it can buff and reduce the resistance for that second element while absorbing the first, right? Sorry, that's a little complicated, but you'll know exactly what I mean when we test it out, right? So I'll begin by demonstrating this with Bennett. Bennett applies Pyro to your character, as you can see, and you'll notice that even if there are no enemies, the Q from Kazuha absorbs Pyro instantly. Venti's Q and Sucrose's Q, on the other hand, they launch forward and cannot do this immediately. Now, the only other character who has an ability that applies the element to your character for long enough is Barbara. I tested Diona's E, you can see here. But switching to Kazuha, it immediately goes away, alright? And then Beto's E, you can apply Electro to her, but the minute you switch to another character, it goes away. Right, so you see there that both Diona's E and Beto's E do apply element to your character, but they're not long enough to be able to utilize this for Kazuha's Q. So this is what it looks like for Hydro Absorption with Barbara. The timer to look for is 23.5 seconds left on your E after cast. This is with C2 because C2 reduces the cooldown by 15%, and then Alt switch to Kazuha to instant cast Q. So for me, Kazuha's on the first slot, so I do Alt 1. And then I'll instant cast Q when I switch him in. Alright, so now that I've shown you guys this, why is this beneficial? Let's move to the Cryo Regisvine to showcase this interaction and mimic freeze or reverse melt comps. So, my team here will be Kazuha, Bennett, and Barbara. My Kazuha is on a 1000 Elemental Mastery build that you can see here. 1000 EM with Freedom Sword and triple EM to showcase a 40% buff if I do manage to swirl a certain element, right? I have no Cryo character on my team, but take a look at this interaction with only Kazuha Q and no E's. You'll see that Kazuha's Q absorbs the Pyro applied by Bennett's Q, but it also swirls Cryo off the core of the Regisvine, leading to a 40% Cryo buff. Pretty cool, right? So that means with pretty easy preparation, one Kazuha Q can prepare a Pyro Q, but swirl off Hydro, Cryo, or Electro if the enemy is tagged with that element, which with 4 Viridescent reduces that Hydro, Cryo, Electro res by 40% and buffs your allies by, in my case, 40% because of 1000 EM of that same Hydro, Cryo, Electro damage. That's a pretty insane mechanic with just one skill and proper preparation. Bennett plus Kazuha was crazy good because of this. Now here's that same mechanic, but with Barbara's E for a Hydro Q, but Cryo buffs. Alright, cool. So, currently, these are the only 2 reliable sources for this mechanic, and Bennett is the easiest one to pull off. And that being said, this strengthens a couple compositions if pulled off correctly. Melt Ganyu, Ganyu Bennett plus Kazuha, where Kazuha absorbs the Pyro, but buffs Cryo damage in 1 Q swing. Other one is Vaporized Tartag. Tartag plus Bennett plus Xiangling plus Kazuha, where Kazuha Q absorbs the Pyro, but buffs Hydro. You need to tag the enemies with Tartag's Hydro first. Both available at C0. Alright, with Kazuha's unique Q mechanics explained, I can now showcase some comps. We have a couple comps here to demonstrate, and hopefully Mr. Cope will be able to denote what type of comps these are and whether or not the Kazuha's Q mechanic is used. Cue the music, Mr. Cope. Okay, and with the showcase complete, that about wraps up the core of this guide. This last section I've left to answer some frequently asked questions, but before I do that, if this guide helped you understand Kazuha a little better, consider liking this video and subscribing to the YouTube channel for more similar content. It's free and I'd really appreciate it. Much love, gamers. Okay, so some common questions I receive on stream, twitch.tv/xlife if you want to catch me there. Question: C6 Sucrose versus C0 Kazuha. So C6 Sucrose, the main thing is that she grants elemental damage bonus for the element that is absorbed during her Q. Answer: this comes down to personal preference. If both are running an 800 pure elemental mastery sword build, C6 Sucrose buffs by 210 EM and 20% elemental damage. C0 Kazuha buffs by 32% elemental damage. Sucrose can only buff 20% for one element. Kazuha can have multiple buffs coexist. Kazuha's general CC is smaller radius than Sucrose, but uptime is more frequent. So that's the general information about those two. I personally would prefer Kazuha because I value uptime and consistency over large CC. Next question: Sucrose versus Kazuha versus Venti. I view Venti for large radius range CC. So his CC is never centered around him, right? You have to target it against an enemy. It's always at a distance. He does refund team energy a little bit better than both of the previous options due to his passive, right, when Stormite ends. Sucrose for Melt and Vaporize, Elemental Mastery Transfer, and Close Distance CC. She can have problems with Q uptime, but that's because her E is on a rather large cooldown. Once you use all of them, you have to wait for quite a bit. Kazuha for melee distance CC, mobility, and his Q mechanic. At C2, he gains the ability to buff elemental mastery of himself and teammates, stealing Sucrose's role that we previously mentioned. Alright, next question regarding constellations. Do they change him drastically and or are necessary? Answer: not necessary at all. His capability at C0 is more than enough. Everything that you saw in this video was all C0 Kazuha. C1 resets his E, which slightly alters his playstyle, but his other constellations just improve his recharge and buffing numbers. If you do C6, he just becomes a whale main or sub DPS, right? Alright, next question. Is the Freedom Sworn sword a really huge upgrade for him? Answer: At R1, not really. Pure Elemental Mastery builds, Iron Sting is perfectly fine and only lacks 30 Elemental Mastery on top of this weapon. So as a sub DPS, there are many options that we tested in this guide that you can go back to, and you can see that a lot of them do perfectly fine compared to the Freedom Sword. If you do have this weapon at R5, well, then you probably have C6 Kazuha anyway, right? So do your thing. And final question, which build? Pure Elemental Mastery or sub DPS? Answer. I personally prefer sub DPS in general Abyss content. His multipliers are high and worth investing in beyond just being a buffer. Cooldowns are low for fast swap comps, making it easy to maximize his E and Q damage and also gain energy back. But I do say that having a set for pure EM is really nice if you want to test out maximum damage of your favorite characters, because that's what buffers are for, right? There's a reason why Sucrose has a place for her Elemental Mastery transfer, and the same thing for pure EM Kazuha. And that about sums things up. If you actually managed to watch this entire video, you are a massive Giga Chad. Thank you so much. All the testing over the past couple days has finally coalesced to this massive video containing all the knowledge I currently have about Kazuha. I wish that everyone's still trying to pull Kazuha the best of luck, and with a final reminder to consider liking and subscribing to the YouTube channel, I really appreciate it. And with that, Mr. Slice signing off. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care.